It begins not with the clamor of machines or the bustle of traffic, but with the quiet sigh of a wind rolling over parched fields. Picture it. A pale dawn rises over a stretch of rural Oklahoma, the sky painted in faded pastels of dusty rose. And washed out blue, there's a sharpness in the morning air, not from cold, but from the scent of dry earth and worry. Wooden houses lean slightly with age, their paint flaking, their porches creaking under the weight of silence. Somewhere, a rooster crows not quite the triumphant call of a prosperous farm, but more a habit, a ritual, stubbornly clinging to routine. This is America in the 1930s, the age of the Great Depression. A world where the clinking of coins in a pocket was rare enough to be a melody, and the warm smell of fresh bread could stir both hunger and heartache. Imagine walking barefoot across the wooden floor of a farmhouse before sunrise. The boards are cold against your skin. You move through dim rooms, guided only by a sliver of light creeping through thin curtains. The kettle is already on the stove, the tin of coffee nearly empty. Outside, the horizon seems to stretch wider than the sky, but the future feels narrow. Fenced in by drought and debt, in cities, it's no different. The skyline of New York stands tall, but even its steel bones cannot support the weight of so much hardship. Soup lines curl around corners like the roots of some giant invisible tree. Men in worn coats lean against brick walls, hats tilted low, waiting for a chance at a job that might not come. Children press their noses against bakery windows, their breath fogging the glass. And yet, in the midst of this, life carried on. Somehow, families endured. They shared meals, laughter, stories, not because times were good, but because they had each other. What does survival look like when the world you knew begins to crack around the edges? How does a mother feed for children with nothing but flour, lard, and hope? Tonight, we'll step into that world. A day in 1930s America, not from the view of history books or political speeches, but from the quiet corners of kitchens, front porches, and factory lines. This is not a tale of presidents or stockbrokers. This is the story of families, of farmers, of small, ordinary moments that held extraordinary strength. Close your eyes if you like. Let your mind wander there with me. To the slow rhythm of a life rebuilt from dust and determination, to the crackle of a radio playing faint jazz in a darkened living room, to the feel of calloused hands kneading dough, and the rustle of patched clothing being folded for another day's wear. Ever wondered what it would feel like to wake up not knowing if there would be enough food to last the week? Can you imagine the sound of your father's boots as he leaves at dawn, not for a job but to search for one? The Depression was not just an economic event. It was a deeply human chapter, written in faded photographs, in scrawled letters, in the silent strength of those who refused to give up. As we move through this story, remember, these were not just hard times. They were moments of unexpected beauty, of resilience, of neighbors sharing apples from a single tree, of children laughing in makeshift cardboard sleds, of a generation learning what it truly means to endure. So settle in. Let the hum of modern life fall away. Let us walk back into the dusty streets and quiet rooms of a time when even the smallest kindness could mean the world. And now, let's step into their day. The rooster's crow was the same every morning, but the weight of each day felt different. In a small farmhouse, nestled somewhere in Kansas, daylight seeped through a threadbare curtain like molasses slow and amber-colored. A girl of 10, hair tangled from sleep, pulls herself from the warmth of a shared bed. Her younger brother lies beside her, curled under a wool blanket mended too many times to count. She tiptoes over the wooden floor, her feet remembering every creak, every cold nailed dot in the kitchen. Her mother is already awake, already busy. There's no clock on the wall, but she knows the time by the feel of light, the sound of the wind, and the hush that settles before the world begins to stir. A pot of something simple simmers on the stove, perhaps cornmeal mush or leftover beans reworked into breakfast. She stirs it slowly, humming a lullaby not for her children, but for herself. It's the same song her own mother sang during hard winters. Songs have a way of surviving. In towns and cities, the mornings were no less solemn. In cramped tenements and sagging row houses, the waking hour came not with an alarm, but with the clatter of pipes, the shuffle of neighbors, the occasional cry of an infant next door. Men shaved with dull razors over chipped porcelain sinks, brushing dust from their threadbare suits. Women pinned up their hair with care, not out of vanity but dignity. The act of getting ready was a ritual proof that they still had purpose. Still had pride. For many, breakfast was sparse. A heel of bread, perhaps soaked in milk. If you were lucky, an egg, maybe even a slice of bacon kept for Sundays. Children often pretended they weren't hungry, so younger siblings could eat more. Hunger became a language of glances, gestures, and quiet refusals. Then the day would truly begin. The walk there might stretch miles across muddy roads or snowy alleys, depending on the season. Some went without shoes. Teachers, underpaid and overburdened, did their best to bring comfort into lessons. A chalkboard, a world map pinned to a peeling wall, the smell of paper and pencil shavings. For a few hours, arithmetic and geography gave children a way to escape, but not every child went to school. Many helped at home or looked after siblings while their parents searched for work. Some sold newspapers, shined shoes, or picked through garbage for salvageable bits of metal or cloth. They learned early that every penny mattered. It'd be like, you might wonder, to grow up where your dreams are always measured against an empty cupboard. Could you find joy in a day where the only surprise is whether there will be meat in the stew? In rural America, life followed the sun. Fields were not always green. They were often cracked and gray from drought. Men rose early, not just out of duty, but out of fear that the crops wouldn't come, that the soil wouldn't forgive them. Dust hung in the air like a ghost. It filled lungs, coated dishes, buried hopes. Farmers watched their land they loved turn against them. Yet, still, they worked. They plowed when they could. They saved seeds. They whispered to the wind like it could hear them. Inside the home, women were magicians. With almost nothing, they spun life into rhythm. A dress too small became a patchwork for a new one. A coffee tin became a pot for flowers. Flour sacks were sewn into aprons, and soap was made from lard and ashes. They stretched meals, stretched pennies, stretched themselves thin to make sure their children could believe the world wasn't falling apart. And somehow, through it all, there was still time for laughter. Children played stickball in alleys, or tag in open fields. They made kites from scraps, built forts out of crates. Board games were passed down and played by candlelight. Radio shows Jack Benny, the Lone Ranger, Little Orphan Anna crackled into homes like magic. Neighbors listened together, crowded around a single speaker, their faces lit by the soft, golden dial. What must it have felt like to laugh in such a time, to hear your child giggle, even when your stomach ached from hunger? How did people find the courage to smile, to sing, to dance, when the world around them seemed so heavy? In the evenings, life settled like dust. Families gathered around modest meals. Sometimes there was meat more often. It was potatoes, cornbread, beans. Grace was said not just out of tradition, but gratitude. Afterward, there might be reading, sewing, or simply sitting together in quiet. Some nights, stories were told, stories of better times, or dreams of what might be. The stars, bright in country skies, untouched by electric haze, became both witnesses and silent companions. In cities, lights flickered in windows, casting yellow glows on brick walls. Street lamps buzzed faintly. Couples sat on stoops, talking, softly, watching the world go by. The rhythm of the city didn't stop, it just slowed. Softened. Sleep came not from comfort, but from exhaustion. Mattresses were lumpy, blankets thin, rooms overcrowded. But people slept. They had to. Tomorrow would come again, whether they were ready or not. And yet, dreams persisted, of jobs returning, of rain falling, of full pantries, warm shoes, and Christmas mornings that didn't come with apologies. Would you find rest, knowing your bills were stacked on the table beside you? Could you fall asleep with the wind rattling the windows and the future whispering uncertain things? These questions linger in the silence of history. They're not just about facts or figures. They are about the spirit of people who, though beaten down by circumstance, still greeted the day with folded hands and lifted chins. And so the day ends as it began, with the sound of wind through dry branches, the smell of cooking grease that clings to the walls, the feel of worn hands folding. Into prayer, another day survived. Another story added to the quiet, enduring tapestry of Depression-era America. Can you picture that? The rhythm of work in Depression-era America wasn't just about earning a wage. It was about dignity. It was about the quiet, persistent pulse of purpose in a world that so often felt like it had stopped making sense. Picture a man named Thomas. He's in his late 40s, once a skilled machinist at a bustling factory in Detroit. Now, he wakes before dawn and walks miles into the city just to scan the bulletin board at the hiring hall. Most days, there's nothing posted. No jobs. Promises, but still, he comes. His suit, the same one he wore on his wedding day, is pressed as neatly as it can be. His shoes are worn, the soles thin, but he carries himself like the man he used to be. A man who once had steady hands and a future mapped out in paychecks and promotions. Thomas waits, day after day, for a foreman's nod, for a day's labor on a dock, for someone to look at him and say, "We could use a strong back." And when there is no work, he doesn't return home empty-handed. He stops at a bakery and asks for crumbs to feed the birds, knowing his youngest daughter will smile. At the treat, pride takes many forms. Sometimes, it looks like a man holding stale bread like it's gold. Across the country, in the vast flatlands of Nebraska, another man, a farmer named Elijah, tends to fields that no longer yield. The soil is dust. The rain hasn't come. But still, each morning he saddles his mule, plows the land, and prays, not just to the heavens, but to the earth itself. "Please," he whispers, "just one more season." Elijah's wife, Margaret, wakes just after him. Her days are a marathon. Of motion, she bakes bread from scratch, knits socks from unraveled sweaters, barters with neighbors, eggs for soap, butter for flour. Her hands never stop moving. Her work, though unpaid, is the glue that holds her world together. And then there are the children, some too young to understand the weight around them, others old enough to feel the change in every silence, every sigh. Teenagers often left school to work, if there was work to be found. They sold apples on corners, hauled coal, repaired shoes. They grew up quickly, learning that responsibility didn't wait for adulthood. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to shoulder your family's hope at 15? Could you give up your dreams so your siblings could have dinner? In cities, jobs disappeared as quickly as they came. Men lined up at factories and rail yards. Women took in laundry or worked long hours as maids and seamstresses. Some families relied entirely on the wages of women, a truth that challenged the norms of the time. But necessity was a louder voice than tradition. The lucky ones worked. In New Deal programs, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, they built roads, planted trees, painted murals. These were more than jobs. They were lifelines, bridges back to a sense of meaning. The WPA didn't just employ hands, it employed spirits. Then there were the transient workers, the hobos, not criminals or vagrants, as they were often labeled, but displaced men and boys chasing rumors of work across the country. They rode freight trains, camped under bridges, scratched coded messages on fences, signs for others who would come after. A circle meant a kind woman lived there. An X warned of cruelty. It was a language of the lost, of those moving through shadows, trying to find the light dot in these moments of movement and labor. Social order became both blurry and defined. Class lines were hardened by the Depression, yet also, in some strange way, softened. The banker and the butcher might both find themselves in a breadline. The immigrant and the third-generation American might share a soup kitchen bench. But inequality still loomed. People of color, especially Black Americans, were often the last to be hired and the first to be fired. Their work was undervalued, their suffering largely unseen by the wider public. And yet their communities held fierce resilience, networks of churches, mutual aid, and cultural pride that kept them afloat when the country failed them, expected to stretch every dollar, every ration, every smile. They were criticized for working, yet blamed when they didn't. They were caretakers, negotiators, and quiet revolutionaries. They sewed dreams into every stitch of clothing they mended. Of Maria, a young mother in Chicago, her husband vanished 2 winters ago, likely chasing work down south. She cleans houses now, 5 in total, scrubbing floors and washing linens for women only a few years older than her. She brings her baby with her in a basket lined with blankets. Each job pays just enough to buy beans, bread, and soap, but she doesn't complain. Instead, she hums lullabies while she scrubs, her voice soft but unbreaking. What does strength look like when no one is watching? Could you keep going day after day, with no applause, no reward, just survival. These weren't just roles people played. They were identities forged by circumstance and tested by hardship. And still, people found ways to contribute, to teach, to mend, to build, to endure. Barbers gave free haircuts on Saturdays. Ministers offered sermons laced with hope. Rather than fire, librarians kept their doors open, offering a warm place and a world of stories. People shared what little they had: a neighbor's pie, a borrowed coat, a hot meal passed through a cracked open door. Social order, though frayed, didn't collapse. It adapted. Families pulled together. Communities leaned on one another. Pride was tempered by necessity, and old divisions of class, of gender, of status sometimes faded in the face of shared survival. Yet still, the old systems lingered. The rich, though fewer, remained largely insulated, and the poor, now vast in number, were often blamed for their plight, as though losing everything had been a choice. Still, within each role, each job, each forgotten corner of labor, there were moments of grace. A father teaching his son how to patch a roof, a mother braiding her daughter's hair by lantern light, a teenager scribbling poetry in a notebook by a fire made from fence posts. These were the invisible hours, the true work of survival. And so, when we speak of Depression-era America, let us not think only of lines and numbers. Let us remember the faces, the hands, the breath of people who, in the absence of comfort, found meaning in the doing, work, however it came. Because sometimes that was all they had. Would you have known what to do, where to go, who to become, if the world had offered you no map? What would you hold on to when all the rules changed overnight? The Depression didn't erase society, it revealed its bones. And those bones, weathered, aching, enduring, held up more than just the roof above. They held the soul of a nation. In Depression-era America carried a different kind of silence, not the peaceful hush of rest, but the fragile quiet of people holding their breath. When the sun dipped below the horizon and lamps flickered to life, something intangible awakened in the air. It was in the way families gathered close, in the way shadows crept across walls, in the way the world seemed to pause and listen. In these long nights, beliefs took root, not just religious ones, though those held firm, but deeper, the kind of beliefs born from fear, hope, and the aching need to explain a world that no longer made sense. In a small church perched on the outskirts of a Georgia town, Reverend Elijah Maynard stands at the pulpit. He speaks with a voice weathered by fire and wind. His congregation listens closely, packed into wooden pews, their hands calloused, their eyes tired. There is no organ music, no stained glass, but there is power, the kind of power that lives in stories passed down through centuries. He reads from the book of Job, a man tested, stripped, abandoned, and for the people sitting before him, this is not metaphor, it is reflection. They, too, feel the test. Crops lost, homes gone, children hungry. And yet they nod, because job endured, because faith endures. In homes across the country, religion became both compass and comfort. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, evangelical, it didn't matter the denomination. What mattered was the ritual. The prayers whispered before sleep, the candles lit in windows, the hymns hummed while washing laundry in cold water. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were anchors. Reminders that someone, somewhere, was watching. Listening that suffering was not in vain. Have you ever clung to a belief, not because it was proven, but because the alternative was unbearable? Could you keep faith alive when the world offered nothing but silence? But belief in those days was not confined to the church, pew, or synagogue. Superstition, folklore, and old-world magic slipped through the cracks of reason like dust beneath. A doorframe dot in Appalachia, people still spoke of signs and portents. A dog howling at the window meant death was near. A bird tapping on glass was a spirit trying to get in. Cornbread crumbs placed under pillows could bring dreams of the future. A silver coin buried at the threshold might ward off hunger. These weren't silly tales. They were rituals passed through generations, whispered at bedsides, taught in kitchens, held like charms against the unknown. On the plains, where dust storms swallowed whole towns, some believed the land itself had turned against them, cursed by broken treaties, by forgotten ancestors, said prayers in languages their grandparents once spoke. The wind, after all, seemed to listen. And then there were the traveling preachers, fiery voices on makeshift stages, calling down the wrath of God or the grace of redemption. Some sold salvation like medicine, others wept openly for the souls they hoped to save. Crowds gathered not just out of faith, but desperation. A miracle, however unlikely, was still a possibility. In cities, too, belief shifted into strange corners. Seances returned. Palm readers saw lines of poverty stretching long and deep. In times of fear, people turned not only to the divine, but to the mystical, to anything that might offer a reason, a rhythm, an answer. Imagine a woman named Dorothea, living alone in a boarding house in Boston. She lights a candle every evening and places it by the window, not for light, but for memory. Her husband lost at sea, her child taken by illness. She keeps his pocket watch beside the flame. Sometimes she says his name aloud, not out of grief, but in the hope that somewhere he still hears her. What is belief, if not love stretched across time and silence? Could you live every day with ghosts and call them company? But not all beliefs brought comfort. Fear walked hand in hand with faith. The fear that God had turned his face, the fear that the world was ending, that the poor were being punished, that hard times were a sign of moral failing. These fears ran deep. Often fed by sermons that thundered rather than soothed, people looked for scapegoats. Immigrants, the poor, the godless. They searched for reasons in faces, in bloodlines, in neighborhoods they didn't understand. And from these seeds, distrust grew, the kind that lingers even after the soil heals. And yet, in the midst of all this, the prayers, the candles, the whispered spells, there was something else, a different kind of belief. Not in gods or curses, but in people, in each other. A neighbor who leaves bread at your doorstep. A teacher who stays late to tutor your child. A stranger who offers you a coat in the bitter cold. These were the miracles of the Great Depression. Small, quiet, almost invisible, but real. A man named Samuel in Pennsylvania opened his barn. To the homeless, he just said, "Stay warm." In a tenement in New York, an old Jewish grandmother told stories to every child in the building. She used Yiddish, broken English, and her hands. Her tales were wild and sweet, and sometimes terribly sad. But the children listened, and through those stories, they learned to hope. These were the beliefs that mattered. That even in ruin, we are not alone. That suffering shared becomes a thread that binds us, rather than a wall that divides. Would you believe in humanity if the world seemed so inhumane? So much of what sustained people in the 1930s wasn't tangible. It couldn't be stored in pantries or folded into wallets. It was the invisible inheritance of hope passed down in songs, in stories, in whispered promises between generations, and that, perhaps, was the truest magic of all. Because even when everything else was gone, jobs, land, savings, certainty, belief remained, and in that belief, a kind of survival, a quiet defiance, a candle in the dark. Would you have lit one, too? The final years of the Great Depression carried a quiet exhaustion, a heaviness that blanketed the country like a tired fog. After nearly a decade of hardship, many Americans no longer asked when it would end. Instead, they asked how much longer they could endure by now. The wounds of the 1930s were not fresh, but deep. They were in the thinness of cheeks, in the hollowness of bank ledgers, in the aching silence of empty schools and shuttered shops. Yet life did not stop. It never does, even in the worst of times. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all. But this chapter of American history, one carved by dust and hunger, could not pass without its storms. There were cracks. In the quiet, some came from the skies themselves. The Dust Bowl, which had begun in the early 1930s, reached its grim crescendo in the middle of the decade. Black clouds rolled across the plains, devouring daylight and choking lungs. In Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, even as far as the Dakotas, the dust turned noon into night. Children wore damp cloths over their faces. Farmers sealed windows with rags and newspapers. But still, it found its way into soup pots, into mouths, into dreams. Standing on your porch and watching the horizon vanish beneath a wall of earth, can you feel the grit between your teeth? The air so thick you can't breathe, can't see, can't think? Would you stay, or would you run? Thousands fled the Dust Bowl. Entire families packed what little they owned into battered trucks and Headed west, California, they hoped, held salvation. But what they found was often suspicion, exploitation, and more hunger. Okies, they were called, regardless of their true origin, and they were treated as less than neighbors. As burdens still, they pressed on, camped in ditches, picked fruit, dug irrigation ditches, anything to survive in the cities. Turmoil wore a different face. Unemployment bred unrest, protest movements flared. In 1932, the Bonus Army, thousands of World War I veterans, marched on Washington, demanding early payment of bonuses promised for their service. They built a sprawling camp in the Capitol. They were peaceful, hungry, desperate. But the government responded with force. Tanks, tear gas, cavalry. The same men who had once defended their country were now chased from its heart with violence. You watch your father, a decorated soldier, be driven from the capital he fought for. Would you still believe in justice? And yet, from this chaos, something remarkable began to stir. A sense that perhaps the system itself had to change, that the old rules had failed. Enter Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Elected in 1932, he brought with him a bold vision. The New Deal. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fast, but it was something. Programs were rolled out to provide jobs, build infrastructure, stabilize banks, and offer hope, however fragile. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted trees, built parks, restored erosion-racked land. But the idea that the government bore some responsibility for the welfare of its people, that was new, that was radical, and it would echo for decades to come. But what about the stories history doesn't always tell? Leave her post, even when unpaid. A black family that organizes a tenant strike in a southern town, demanding fair rent and dignity. These two were revolutions no less powerful for their invisibility. And then, just as the nation began to stagger to its feet, industry and rebuilding, factories roared to life. Jobs returned. It was buried beneath the weight of war machines and military drafts. But the scars remained, and so did the memory. Can you imagine what it must have felt? Like, after all that suffering, to be told to fight again, only this time, not for your family's survival, but for the world's. Would you feel pride or weariness? Even now, nearly a century later, the legacy of the Great Depression clings to us like dust in an old barn. It lives in caution passed down through generations. In stories told by grandparents of hardship and grit, in mason jars were used, in light switches always turned off. In every child taught not to waste, it lives in the architecture of our government, in the policies we debate, the programs we rely on, the safety nets some seek to preserve, others to dismantle. It lives in our culture. 2. In novels like The Grapes of Wrath, in photographs of hollow-eyed children and wind-blown mothers, in folk songs sung around campfires and kitchen tables. But most of all, it lives in the questions it left behind. What does it mean to survive? Not just in body, but in soul. When the banks failed, when the soil dried, when the jobs vanished. But stories tell us why it mattered. And those stories, your great-grandmother's bread recipe, your grandfather's patched coat, the silence that fell in your childhood home when the subject came up, they are the thread between then and now. Would you have made it? In those days, would you have held on to hope? And what of us today? Do we learn from the echoes of the past, or do we merely survive them? The Great Depression was not just a moment of loss, it was a mirror, a way. And sometimes, what we saw was terrifying. But sometimes, often in the smallest acts, the softest voices, it was beautiful. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, let your mind linger on the stories left behind of dust, of breadlines, of soft lullabies sung in empty homes. And remember, history is not just about what we fear.